Okay. Okay, so again, it's really wonderful to see everyone. Hope everyone is managing well and adapting, and that everyone is safe and healthy. Thank you so much for taking some time to learn and get prepared for the upcoming holiday of Chanukah. As always, you could put a question to the chat box, or you could also unmute yourself, later on in the shiur to share a thought or ask a question. All right, so Chanukah is 8 days this year, as it is always. And it begins, actually, the first night of Chanukah is Thursday night, Friday, so it's in 2 nights we begin the holiday of Chanukah. Chanukah is not mentioned anywhere in Tanakh. And of course, that makes sense that it wouldn't be mentioned anywhere in Tanakh because Tanakh, the books of Tanakh were canonized, completed in around the 5th century before the Common Era. And the events of Chanukah took place a few hundred years later in the year, 166, 165, 164, before the Common Era, in the middle of the days of the Second Commonwealth. Now, even though it's not mentioned in Tanakh, but there are a few hints, so just kind of like acute hints to kind of like serve as appetizers for the shiur, which is that does anyone know what the 25th word of the Torah is? Actually, believe it or not, is Or. Vayomer Elokim Yihi Or. Or is the 25th word of the Torah, and of course, 25 is the day of Chanukah. Chanukah is the 25th of Kislev. In Parshat Maseh, in the book of Bamidbar, it talks about all the different destinations where the Jewish people traveled over the course of their travels in the wilderness, and the 25th place that they traveled to in the wilderness is a place called Chashmona. And so again, the number 25, kind of like, being alluded to in the Chumash, Chashmona, of course, similar to the word Chashmonaim, which is the family of Chashmonaim, who were the ones who led the revolt against the Syrian Greeks. So, but even with those hints, as you know, so as I mentioned, the stories of Chanukah and the events of Chanukah are not in Tanakh. So one might say that in a certain sense, this is a holiday that celebrates Torah Sheba'al Peh, because this is not in the Torah Shebechsav of Tanakh, it's in the oral law, and so it celebrates, in a certain sense, the Masorah, the tradition of the oral law and the transmission over the course of the generations, and we'll come back to that a little bit. Parenthetically, but interestingly, we're thinking a lot about gifts this time of year. So, there's a lot of discussion in terms of what's the origin of gifts. Did we get it from them or did they get it from us? Is one of the ways you might want to put it. But I once heard from Rav Shechter in a shiur of Herschel Shechter. I don't think he was joking, and I don't know where he got this from, but he said that the origin of gifts is actually because it's the holiday of Torah Sheba'al Peh. So it celebrates the victory. Chanukah celebrates the victory of the Torah, of Torah wisdom, over Greek culture. And so, being that is one of the themes of Chanukah, that is the victory of Chachmas HaTorah over Chachma Yevanet. So what they did was that they would bring gifts. The kids would bring gifts to the teachers, to the Rabbeim, on Chanukah. Right, the Rebbeim, those who taught the Torah, and it's the victory of the Torah and the wisdom and the spiritual force of Torah over the secular forces of Hellenism, of Greek culture. So they would bring gifts to the Rebbeim on Chanukah, and then over the course of time, that developed into people giving gifts to family members, and friends. That was Rav Shechter's theory in terms of how gift giving began on Chanukah. But what I wanted to get to is, what is the symbolism of the menorah? And the Rambam has some beautiful language about the menorah. He says in Hilchos Chanukah, Perek Daled Halacha Yud Beis, and it's interesting. Parenthetically, the Rambam wrapped together the halachos of Megillah and Chanukah, so it's called Hilchos Megillah v'Chanukah. And so the halachos of Chanukah begin in Perek Gimel in the 3rd chapter of Hilchos, Megillah, and Chanukah. And in a few places, the Rambam actually compares Chanukah to Megillah. So, for example, he says, just like you say, just like you say the bracha of Shas and Nisam Lavoseina by Megillah, you say it also by Chanukah. And that everyone who's chayiv, anyone who's obligated in the reading of the Megillah, is obligated in Neros Chanukah. And he considers these two, right? These two holidays, of course, are the two major rabbinically mandated holidays. And so the Rambam draws some connections between Chanukah and Megillah. But here's what he says about Ner Chanukah. He says, mitzvahs Ner Chanukah, mitzvah chaviva hi ad ma'od. That the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah that we're going to start observing on Thursday, and we're going to light 1 candle on the first night and 2 candles on the second night and 3 candles on the third night, in accordance with the position of Beit Hillel. Beit Hillel holds that we go upwards in number always because we always want to go upwards and grow in holiness. So the Rambam says, mitzvahs ner Chanukah, mitzvah chaviva hi ad ma'od. It's a precious mitzvah. V'tzarech adam lihizaher ba. And a person has to be careful about this mitzvah, kidei lahodia hanes, to publicize the miracle. Ula hosef b'sheva hakel v'hodaya lo, and to praise Hashem and to express gratitude for the miracles that Hashem did for us. And so the question is, why is it so precious? When we light the Chanukah candles over the course of the holiday, what story are we telling? What are the messages of the menorah? By the way, it's not, Rav Soloveitchik was fond of saying that there's no mitzvah to use a menorah, by the way, because somebody it just came up at the table a few days ago where someone said, that what happens if you have a few people using the same menorah, then how are they going to fulfill the mitzvah, after the 4th or 5th night, because you don't have enough candles on the menorah. So I just pointed out that the Rav Soloveitchik said, yeah, we use a Chanukah, which reminds us of the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash. The original miracle took place with the oil in the Beis Hamikdash. So we use a menorah and we call it a Chanukah because that's what holds the candles. And that reminds us of the menorah of the Beis Hamikdash. But really, it's not necessary from a halachic perspective to use a menorah. And so if it's Chayalei Tzahal and they're out in the field or you're traveling, so if you just have a candle and you put the candle down, right, that's a fulfillment of the mitzvah. Right, 1 candle each night is fulfillment of the mitzvah, and of course, as we said, you light parallel to the number of night, but there's really no obligation of a Chanukah. The focus is really on the candle. So, what story are we telling with the lighting of the candles, and why is it a mitzvah chaviva? Why is it such a precious mitzvah? One other place where this concept comes up and that shows how precious this mitzvah is, that we say lahadlik ner shel Chanukah. And the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, who was a rabbi first in Germany, in Ashkenaz, in the end of the 13th century, but then he ended up, the end of his life in Spain. He was the chief rabbi of Toledo for the last 20 years of his life. The Rosh is a very interesting commentary because he blends together the traditions of Ashkenaz and Sfard. So the Rosh says that whenever you have a mitzvah, that you could have somebody else fulfill it on your behalf, typically the bracha will be al. Like al biur chametz, right? Brachat Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher yishem v'sasanu al biur chametz. Why? Because really we like doing bedikas chametz and burning the chametz ourselves, but you can ask somebody else to check your house for you. So typically, when you are able to appoint somebody else to do the mitzvah, so like for example, al mikra Megillah, somebody else is reading the Megillah on our behalf, and then we're listening, and by listening to the Megillah, it's tantamount to kind of saying it ourselves, and that's the way we fulfill the mitzvah. But if you're appointing somebody to read the Megillah for you, shofar is lishmoa kol shofar, because the mitzvah is what? Is listening to the shofar. Every single person has to listen to the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. So that's why the blessing that's made is lishmoa kol shofar, because you have to do it yourself. So the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel, 13th, 14th century, develops this idea that when it comes to blessings on mitzvot, so when you have to do it yourself, usually you say it lishmoa kol shofar. A man, right, when you put on tefillin, what bracha do you say? You say lahaniach tefillin. But when you could appoint somebody else to do the mitzvah for you, then typically you say al. I'll be your chumate. I don't want to get into the weeds. I don't want to get into the weeds of this particular thing. Okay. The reason for al natil yadayim, very good.
Exactly.
The reason for al natil yadayim, the Rush addresses that because there's another rule that if you don't make the bracha prior to doing the whole mitzvah, then you say al. And for that reason, that's why it's al natilat lulav, because very often you've already fulfilled the mitzvah before saying the bracha. And same thing with natil yadayim. So there you wash your hands before saying the bracha. It's kind of an exception. So for that reason, even though you have to wash your own hands for bread, and because of that, you would have thought that it should be litolet hayadayim. The Rush says another principle that the number one, if you do it yourself, it's le, but also you only say le if it's future focused, if you're going to do the mitzvah. But if there are times where at least part of the mitzvah is done prior to the bracha, like with natil yadayim, then it's al, because you can't say litolet hayadayim if you've already washed your hands. So you say the bracha of al natil yadayim. I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but the Rush wonders, what about Ner Chanukah? Right? Ner Chanukah, and this is where we bring it back to home here with Chanukah. Yes, it's Ner Chanukah, you really fulfill the mitzvah one candle per house. Yes, the minig Ashkenaz is for every single person in the house to light. Very often the husband and wife, if you're blessed to be married and a husband and wife, so then they light one Chanukah. Typically, I'm the one who lights it in our house. Once in a while, Jordana lights, and she's done it on behalf of both of us. But in any case, although Rav Soloveitchik felt the husband can light, and the wife can light. But leaving aside the husband and the wife, they could either light together, where the husband lights for both, or the wife also lights. But the minig Ashkenaz is that, right? Differently, if you have multiple people in the house, so then everyone lights, and you light parallel to the number of nights, right? But really, the mitzvah, if you can't fulfill the mitzvah, you could appoint somebody else to light for you. You could have somebody else light the menorah for you. So, of course, there's a mitzvah min hamufcha. It's preferable for you to do it when you're in your house, but you could ask somebody else to light to fulfill the baseline level of the mitzvah. So the Rush says, why therefore is the bracha lahadlik ner shel Chanukah? Lahadlik ner shel Chanukah implies that every single person has a responsibility to personally say that blessing and to do the mitzvah. And I think a wife can light on behalf of a husband, because a wife is obligated in the mitzvah, just like a woman is obligated in the mitzvah on the same level as a man. The Gemara says that just like a man is obligated, a woman is obligated in Erev Chanukah on the same level. Both are rabbinic, because of the principle of what? Af hein hayu ba'oso hanes. Women were also part of the miracle of Chanukah. Not only that, but one of the commentaries says that there were women who were instrumental in the victory of Chanukah. Yehudis, remember Yehudis? The daughter of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, who killed the Greek governor, and that was one of the key turning points in the revolt against the Greeks, was when Yehudit, with great courage and bravery, killed the Greek governor. The reason, the background to that is that there was one of the decrees of the Greeks was that any Jewish woman getting married would have to be together with the governor first. And so this obviously was one of the ways that the Greeks defiled the purity of the Jewish people. And it was in that context when Yehudit was getting married that she was with the Greek governor, and she fed him some dairy. Do you remember that? She fed him some dairy food, and she killed him. It's remarkably similar to which story in Tanakh?
with the war with Sisra.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So that's with Yael and Sisra, and Yael does that as well. And so similarly, Yehudit. This is hundreds of years later. Yehudit does something similar to what Yael did, and she kills the Greek governor with dairy food. And
was his name Holofernes? Greek governor's name?
It was Holofernes, yeah.
Holofernes, yes.
I think that's that could be what his name. That's I think some suggest that was his name. I'm not sure if it's clear what his name was, but that's why. Did you know that there's a custom to have dairy food on Chanukah?
Of course, because of that.
Because of that, that's right. Because of that miracle, we tend to associate dairy food with Shavuot, and it is a custom to have dairy on Shavuot. But the Shulchan Aruch says that there's a minhag to have dairy on Chanukah to remember that miracle with Yehudit. So this is one of the stories that leads one of the commentaries on the Gemara to say it wasn't just that women were included in the decree and the miracle of Chanukah, but actually they were instrumental. Women were instrumental in clinching the miracles of Chanukah. But leaving that aside, so why is it lahadlik ner shel Chanukah? So listen to the Rush. Getting back to the Rush says, you want to know why? Even though you could appoint somebody else to do the mitzvah for you, every single Jew desires to do the mitzvah himself or herself. And because the mitzvah is chaviv, because it's precious, because it's dear, because it's a dear and precious mitzvah, everyone wants to fulfill the mitzvah on her own or his own. And that's why the bracha is lahadlik ner shel Chanukah. The beautiful answer of the Rush, and it fits in with the Rambam that we just quoted before. The Rambam says it's a mitzvah chaviva ad mod. It's a precious mitzvah because we want to publicize the story of Chanukah. The Rush says also similarly because it's a precious mitzvah. Every single person wants to do it on his own, and that's why the bracha is lahadlik. Even though you could actually appoint someone else technically to do it, the bracha is lahadlik ner shel Chanukah. All right, let's
Rabbi,
get it
just
now.
one very quick question.
Yeah, Miriam.
Is it a chov for the women to light it as it is for the men? Is it a chov like going to shul is still not a chov for women? Of course, so many do, but is it a chov for them to light the candles of
Yes. The Torah promotes equality when at times. And in this case, right, yes, there is absolute equality between a man and a woman, as far as I understand it, that on a rabbinic level, it's not a Torah obligation to light Hanukkah candles, but rabbinically, there's an obligation on a woman similar to the obligation that's imposed upon a man. Now, let's get into a little bit of the history, but before I do that, I want to just look through the chat box to see if, just to see if I'm getting everyone here. Okay, yes, the wife can technically light on behalf of the husband. Alatil Yadayim we addressed. Okay, let's move on with your permission. So what's the story of the menorah? What's the symbolism of the Neiros Chanukah? So just a couple other historical details, which is that this was after the days of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great died around 320, I think 323 before the Common Era, and he was someone who held Judaism in high esteem. He respected Judaism. It was 150 years later or so, Antiochus Epiphanes, who, of course, Antiochus. And by the way, I wanted to mention, even though it's not in Tanakh, the story of Chanukah is not in Tanakh, but the story of Chanukah is narrated and found in which books?
Maccabees.
Very good. It's found in the book of Maccabees, and it's found in the War of the Jews, and it's also found in Megillat Antiochus. I mean, these are all the book of Maccabees. So it's not part of Tanakh. It doesn't have the sanctity as one of the books of the Tanakh canon, but the Book of Maccabees is respected as a legitimate source, and it's written by passionate Jews. And we accept the Book of Maccabees as a source, that helps us understand those events, even though it doesn't have the sanctity of Tanakh. So in the Book of Maccabees, it shares some of the details of Antiochus. That basically Antiochus was someone, he suspected the Jews of being loyal to the Ptolemaic Egyptian part of the Greek kingdom. The Greek kingdom split into a couple different parts. There was the Seleucid Greeks in Syria, and then you had the Ptolemaic in Egypt rulers. And it was basically two different parts of the kingdom. And so the Syrian Greek, the Seleucid Greek king Antiochus, suspected the Jews of being loyal to the Egyptian rulers. But also Antiochus basically wanted to wipe out Judaism, and he wanted to Hellenize the Jews. And so for that reason, Antiochus and the Greeks enacted many, many decrees against the Jews at that time. And this starts getting us to understand what was going on, that it wasn't just the miracle of an oil. That's what I'm going to try to develop now. The miracle of the oil symbolizes a story. I mean, the oil they did find one jug of oil, the Gemara says, and that one jug of oil lasted for 8 nights. It was the everlasting oil. But the menorah, the miracle of the oil, is really a symbolic of a greater victory. And the Rambam gets into that, because the Rambam says, he says, this is in the very first halach of the Rambam. And so this is Hilchos Chanukah Perek Gimel. Wait a second, if it's chapter 3, how could it be the first halach of the Rambam? Well, I told you, because it's Hilchos Megillah v'Chanukah. So in the first halach of Hilchos Chanukah, of Hilchos Megillah v'Chanukah, the Rambam says, B'bayis Sheni, in the days of the Second Temple, Keshemalcha Yavin Gazu Gzeres al Yisrael, that the Greek government issued many decrees preventing the Jews from observing Judaism. Ubadlu data, v'lo hinichu otam la'asok b'torah v'mitzvot. They prevented us from doing this. You see, they prevented us from studying Torah. You have so many other things to be doing now, right? But you chose to study Torah, right? Because you care deeply about Chanukah. You get chizuk from one another. Once in a while, we learn a couple interesting things here, right? But you care about learning Torah, and you love learning Torah and observing mitzvot. So the Malchei Yavan prevented the Jews from doing mitzvot. Upashtu yadam b'mamodam. They also seized our property. Uvivinotehem, and they also violated our daughters. And we made reference to this a little bit earlier, right? With the Greek governor and Yehudit, and Yehudit feeding dairy. So the Rambam makes reference to this when he says, Upashtu yadam b'mamonam uvivinotehem, that they seized our assets, but they also violated our women. They contaminated and defiled everything. And then he says, so there was a great religious persecution, and there was tremendous pressure on the Jewish people at that time. And Chanukah was very different than Purim. How is Chanukah different than Purim? Purim, Haman wanted to exterminate the Jewish people, and he was looking to for genocide of the Jewish people. In the story of Chanukah, right, Chanukah is less about the physical extermination or the threat of that, but rather it was more the threat of the spiritual influence that the Yavanim were trying to do against the Jewish people. That's why, by the way, we don't celebrate on Purim. We celebrate with a party, right? It's a much more physical celebration because it was a physical threat on Purim. It was a more physical salvation, and therefore we celebrate in more of a material, physical way. On Chanukah, it's interesting. On Chanukah, it was more of a spiritual threat, where the Greeks were preventing us from keeping Torah and mitzvahs. And the Torah and mitzvahs that we're able to observe were in very minimalistic fashion. We weren't able to do the mitzvot in the proper maximalist way that we strive for. And so there was a spiritual threat. It was a more spiritual salvation, which we're going to come back to, and therefore we celebrate more spiritually. So there's really no mitzvah, ladies and gentlemen and friends, all of you, my friends. There's no mitzvah to have a meal on Chanukah. There's a mitzvah to have a meal on Purim. And there's actually no halal on Purim, right? Although the Rambam says that the Megillah is the halal, but there's no halal on Purim, but there's a big meal. On Chanukah, there's halal 8 days because it's about the spiritual victory and recognition of the role of Hashem in that victory. And there's no mitzvah to have a meal. The Ramah says, I guess maybe the Ramah knows that Jews like celebrating around the table, and that food has to be part of our celebration. The Ramah says that if you have a Dvar Torah at the meal, that transforms the meal into a Sudas mitzvah. So on Chanukah, even though there's no mitzvah to have a meal like Purim, but if you have a meal and you say a Dvar Torah, so then that mitzvah, that meal becomes a Sudas mitzvah. But what the Rambam, the way the Rambam says it over here is that at that time of persecution, what happened? Asher richem aleim Elokei avotenu. Hashem had mercy on us. That was the first step of the process of victory, which is very beautiful. That Hashem had mercy on us because we can't do anything without the power of Hashem. The Gobru b'nei Chashmonai haKohanim haGadolim, the Chashmonaim, that was led by Matisyahu and his 5 children, including Yehuda Maccabee, right? The Chashmonaim, who were Kohanim, led the revolt against the Syrian Greeks. And listen to the end of the Rambam. The Chazra Malchut li Yisrael, Yeser al Masayim Shana ara Churban Hasheni. That independent sovereignty returned to the Jewish people for more than 200 years until the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So to me, I think if we talk about the symbolism of Ner Chanukah, that this is one idea I wanted to share first, but I'm going to get to my main idea in a moment, that it's not just the miracle of the menorah. The menorah highlights the ability of the Jewish people to restore their self-governance and independent sovereignty. And the Chashmonaim, by the way, it was nothing to write home about, these kings. And they were not so righteous. The Chashmonai kings were not that righteous. And in fact, some criticize the Chashmonaim for becoming kings altogether because they were Kohanim. And we know that the kings are supposed to come from which Shevet?
Yehuda.
Yeah.
Yehuda, that's right. Yehuda, I saw a bunch of you coming forward to tell me that they're supposed to be from Yehuda. By the way, some suggest that maybe that's why Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi did not include the laws of Chanukah in the Mishnah. Chanukah happened a couple hundred years before the editing of the Mishnah and the compilation of the Mishnah.
No,
So it's kind of like a mystery, maybe for a different shiur. Why did Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi not include the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah in the Mishnah? Now, that's not entirely true. There are a few places where Ner Chanukah kind of like creeps its way into the Mishnah, like in the laws of torts and damages, if an animal is going past the store and the load on the animal catches fire. So if it's the Ner Chanukah, then the store owner had a right to put it there, and the traveler should have taken more care, to guard his animal. But it kind of just pops in there, Ner Chanukah. But you don't have a whole Masechta. We don't have a whole tractate about Chanukah. The pages about Chanukah appear in Masechta Shabbos. So one of the, as opposed to like Megillah, right? There's a whole tractate about the miracle of Purim and the mitzvah of Megillah. So one of the theories is that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi left it out of the Mishnah because that was like his protest, either because the Chashmonaim were not righteous monarchs, or because Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, this was his way of protesting the fact that they were Kohanim. They belonged in the Beis Hamikdash. They belonged as spiritual leaders. They should not have been political. They should not have been political leaders. And so one theory is that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi left it out of the Mishnah for that reason. But which is, I think, fascinating to think about that. But what I want to share over here is that you heard what the Rambam said? That the Rambam, his very first, the significance of Chanukah, he doesn't get to the menorah yet. He says that the significance of Chanukah, even though these Chashmonaim were not great kings, and even though, both they weren't that righteous, and they were also Kohanim, so from a couple different angles, they weren't the ideal choice as prime ministers or as kings. But yet the Rambam viewed that as inherently significant, that the Jewish people had independent sovereignty. What does the Rambam say? V'chazar Malchut liYisrael. Malchut returned to the Jewish people for more than 200 years until the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So this is just a plug for religious Zionism, for us Zionists on the call, and Beth Jacob is a proudly Zionistic community, of course, and we love Medinat Yisrael, and we pray for the welfare of, right, Medinat Yisrael Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu every Shabbat. So if you need to find a source, I mean, there's many sources and there's a lot to talk about in terms of we believe, of course, in the religious significance of the establishment of the State of Israel. We believe that the State of Israel is the conduit through which the redemption of the Jewish people is going to take place. And of course, there's many dimensions of how grateful we are for the miracle of Israel. But if you just talk about, is there value in sovereignty? So I like this Rambam. I very much like this Rambam, this very first paragraph of the Rambam in Hilchos Chanukah, where he says that that Chanukah was a special miracle in that sovereignty returned to the Jewish people for 200 years. And so this is just a source that we could point to in terms of the value of governance and sovereignty in Israel, even if they're not perfect, right? And certainly the Chashmonaim monarchs were not perfect. But that's the Rambam. But now I wanted to just share in terms of the symbolism of the menorah. It's a greater thing going on. It's the restoration of sovereignty. But what else? If you could share a thought, I'll open it up to the group now. You're welcome to share that. But what is it? So the miracle of the menorah? I mean, that's an incredible miracle. But that's not what it's all about, is it? It's about independent. It's about restoration of sovereignty. What else is Chanukah about?
The Pach Shemen, of course.
That's what I just said. The Pach Shemen that they found, and it was 1 day of oil, and it lasted 8 days. Classic question of the Beit Yosef is, why do we keep 8 days of Chanukah? It should just be 7 days of Chanukah. I'm not going to get into that now.
Because the first day is not a miracle.
Another thing is the physical victory of the Maccabim over the Greeks, because there were very few Maccabim and there was a huge Greek army.
Oh, okay. So great. So there's actually those who say, you see here that it's basically the main miracle wasn't the oil, but it was actually the military victory. Great. So it's the restoration of sovereignty, but it's also the military victory. And indeed, the Meiri Rifki gives that answer as well in terms of why there are 8 days of Chanukah. He says 7 days is for the miracle of the oil, and 1 day is for the military victory against the odds, right? Rabin biyad miyatim, and it shows that the Jewish people are not governed by statistics, and we have the ability to overcome the odds on the battlefield, just like we did in 48 and 67, and just like Bayam Mahim Bazman Hazeh. But that's what happened in the story of Chanukah. Yeah, Lonnie.
No, it's okay.
Okay, I thought you unmuted yourself there. Okay, yeah, Fran.
Leaving aside the religious aspect and the historical aspect, to me, the flame, the light, is a spiritual thing. It it's within us, and never to give up hope, and we shine, we're bright, and that's how I take it.
Wonderful, beautiful idea. To never give up hope, and to keep that flame alive, and we could bring light to overcome the darkness. But it's a spiritual thing. Very good, and that's going to be my direction in a moment. Yeah, Miriam.
I could do your lecture.
Yeah, go ahead. Take it away. Take it
I
away.
was going to say that I think it's the first time that we have in recorded history a battle for religious freedom. Again, emphasizing a very small group of people overcoming a huge army. So that all that has been said. But what I wanted to do is kind of second Fran's idea, because each year that we have Chanukah, and then I'm a year older, for which I'm very grateful, I think when I see the lights, that we need to be the light. We don't necessarily derive the light, which we do, although it says you can't you can't use the light, but that we need to think of ourselves anew each year. And that is that we ourselves must be the light for others, even if it's one person, and to improve that person's lot in life, to make that person a happier individual, to say nothing of more. Therefore, we ourselves have the inner light that we may not keep.
Beautiful idea.
Give it to others.
Thank you.
Rabbi Topp, I think it's also that it was a form of tshuva, I want to say.
Nice.
Because the Chashmonaim, as you say, were not the most righteous, and there were a lot of things. There was corruption and so forth. That they could have used a pach shemen that was not pure. They could have actually lit the menorah with an unpure pach shemen, but they chose, when rededicating the Beis Hamikdash, to use pure. It's like they wanted to start a new leaf without, I don't know if they were corrupt afterwards, because I don't know the history well, but they could have used a pach shemen that was not tahor. Yet they chose to use tahor because they wanted to start it fresh and pure and holy. So to me, that was a concept of tshuva.
Tshuva for what? The tshuva for?
Tshuva for being, maybe for the corruption, okay. Because I know there's corruption there's a lot of corruption with the Kohanim, and that they took the Malchus and maybe they weren't supposed to, and this, that, and the other.
That was after Rivki.
Okay.
Okay.
They took them after, but were they?
There were a lot of Jews themselves. There were a lot of Jews themselves who were Hellenized, and there was also Jew against Jew. Yeah, go ahead, Ron.
It was also a cultural, philosophical, and ideological victory of Hellenism versus Judaism. It's two cultures clashing. And the fact that they rededicated the temple was actually the high point of it.
Okay, great. Okay, good. So let me really relating to putting, basically building off some of those ideas that each of you shared, beautiful ideas about the light, about spirituality, about tshuva. I like that idea about tshuva. So let's see if we can develop that a little bit, Rivki. And for all of you, if you look at the book of Maccabees, so it was the 15th of Kislev. It was the 15th of Kislev. And now a lot of times I share sources with you. Tonight I figured let's just keep it, without sources. But if you look at the book of Maccabees, it says the 15th of Kislev, the desecration of the sanctuary began. And it was on the 25th day of Kislev, when it was kind of like the pinnacle of desecration, the ultimate desecration occurred of the Beis Hamikdash, when they brought in idols into the inner part of the temple. And it was a few years later, when after the victory of the Chashmonaim, who fought, they revolted, of course, and they were fighting for our values and for our tradition, where they were cleaning up the Mikdash, and it was on that exact day of the 25th that they chose to rededicate the Beis Hamikdash. So if you read the book of Maccabees, it's not just that it happened on the 25th, but they chose on the exact day that the heathens had profaned it, had desecrated it. They chose that day after their victory, and it was a very dramatic military victory against the odds. They chose that day to rededicate and sanctify the Beis Hamikdash. Why did they choose 8 days? Now, the traditional explanation is that because it took 8 days for them to produce. You ever wonder that? Why 8 days? You know, because it took them, the Rambam says, and others, the Meiri says, it took them 8 days to produce the finest oil, the finest olive oil. So that's interesting that they needed the finest olive oil, which we'll come back to in a moment. But the other possibility is that they also wanted to, they also wanted to kind of tie it in to previous, to previous things that occurred in history. So the Chanukah Mishkan, right, the dedication of the Mishkan, took 8 days. In Bayit Rishon, when King Shlomo builds the first Beis Hamikdash, and he has a major party, the 8th day of Sukkot is the culmination of the inauguration of the celebration, and then he sends everyone home. So again, you have that number 8. So this could have also played a role in the Chashbonaim establishing the 8 days of the Chanukah. So it wasn't just that the oil lasted 8 days, but that they established 8 days of celebration. Why? Because they wanted to pattern it after previous inaugurations of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Mishkan, which was 8 days, and of the first Beis Hamikdash, which was also the 8 days of Sukkot. It took the week before Sukkot, but it was the 8th day of Sukkot that the Torah says, the Tanakh says in Malachim Aleph Perek Chet. Malachim Aleph Perek Chet. On the 8th day, that's when Shlomo Melech sends him home. So what I want to suggest is that this was the 25th of Kislev, was the day where the Jewish people demonstrated that you want to desecrate Judaism, you want to prevent us from keeping Torah. We have the ability to sanctify. And there's on the day that they desecrated on the 25th, that's the day that we sanctified. And ultimately, the miracle of the menorah represents wisdom. And it represents the idea that our religion and values were able to persevere and triumph even over the juggernaut of Hellenism. And we have the capacity, and what they demonstrated, the Chashmonaim demonstrated, was their ability to fight for our values, to fight for Torah. It's really the perseverance of our Masorah in the face of Hellenism, and the courage to stand up for Torah, in the face of all the secularism and all the influences and all the corruption. So Rivki, in terms of the tshuva you're talking about, that's what I think about when I think about Chanukah, is instead of the tumah, instead of the impurity, not just the impurity of the Beit HaMikdash, but the impurity of society, we demonstrated that we could adhere to purity, which is symbolized by the menorah. On the 25th day of Kislev, when in the book of Maccabees it mentions that was the day they brought idols into the temple, and it was the ultimate in the desecration, that was the day we flipped it around. We flipped it around and made it a day of sanctity. And basically, what Bayam Mehem Bazman Hazeh, the lights of the menorah represent our ability. That light of the menorah really is a message for all generations. For all generations, that we have the ability to keep Torah and keep mitzvot, even when difficult, even when there's a lot of influences. And that's a very, very powerful lesson, because it's not just that we can keep Torah, but that we can keep it well, and that we can be proud, and we could stand tall. How do I know that from Chanukah? Because, right, you needed the purest, finest olive oil. And that's why it took them 8 days to produce it. we fulfill the mitzvah, right? In the best of the best possible way. It's the only mitzvah, my friends, that has 3 tiers to it. One tier is 1 candle per house. Second tier is every single person lights a candle, the Gemara says, and the highest level is to light according to the number of nights. And that becomes the way we fulfill the mitzvah. Mahadrim and a Mahadrim. By the way, the story is told, it might be fictional, of just another way to light the menorah. The Hasidic Rebbe, when he was lighting the menorah, so when he was lighting the menorah, the jar of oil fell on the floor and spilled all over the place. And the Hasidic Rebbe took his broom, it was in his house, and all the Hasidim were around. No masks, no distancing. They were all right. It was pre-COVID. Remember those days? And the oil fell on the floor, and he took a broom and he cleaned it up. And he said to the because he knew that the Hasidim would all follow what he did. So he said, "This is nish l'dairos. This is not for future generations." And every future year, so when the Hasidim were in their house, they would throw the oil on the floor, they would break it, they would clean it up with a broom, and they would say to one another, "This is nish l'dairos. This is not for future generations." So that's one way the menorah is lit. But when we light the menorah, we light with the best oil. At least that's the way they did it then, with pure oil, and that's the preferable way to do it. We light parallel to the number of nights, which is the best of the best way to do it. And Rifki touched on something, or I think it was Rifki who touched on it earlier also, Rifki, in terms of they could have lit with impure oil. But that would have not only been anticlimactic, that would have gone against the whole purpose of the revolt. Because the Jewish people at that time had to cut corners. They couldn't observe Judaism in the full regular way. If they were able to observe the mitzvot, it was like in the basement, and it was quickly, and they were nervous. They were nervous when they were doing the mitzvot a lot of times in those days because of the legislation, because of the persecution. And so the revolt of the Chashmonaim was not just to fight for the Torah spiritual values, but it was also to restore maximalism in our observance. It was to restore the ability to observe Judaism proudly, freely, in a maximal way. And so if they would have, when they rededicated the temple, if they would have lit with the tamei oil, there is a halachic principle that if all the oil is tamei, you can light with tamei oil. If all the kohanim are tamei, are defiled, a kohen who's defiled can serve in the Beis Hamikdash. That's true. That is a halacha, Abby. That is a halacha. But if they would have relied on that principle, that's a b'di'evet principle. That's not ideal to do it that way. So had they relied on that principle that you could use defiled oil when all the oil is tamei, that would have contravened. That would have gone against a major part of the purpose of their revolt. Their revolt was fighting for the perseverance of Jewish values. It was for the ability for Torah and Masorah to overcome all the Hellenistic influences, but it was to restore maximalism in Jewish observance. And that we keep the Torah no matter what, even when it's difficult, we keep the Torah and we keep it in the right way. And so to me, that I think is a lot about the symbolism of the menorah, not just about oil that lasted 8 days, but it's symbolic of something much bigger. It's symbolic of again, the restoration of sovereignty, we said. Number 2, and it's symbolic of it's symbolic of the military victory against all odds, which also has resonance for nowadays. And number 3, it's really a chizuk to all of us. I think when you see that light, it's light in the darkness. It's light in the darkness, and that's a powerful message for all of us. That in these dark times, right, to never lose hope, never despair. We always have that light, and we can bring light to others and bring light to the world. And actually, Prince Charles said this in his tribute to Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, right? where he said beautifully that he deliberately misquoted Yeshaya as saying that Rabbi Sachs was a light unto this nation of Great Britain. That right, the Jewish people are supposed to be a light unto the nations, but that Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs is a light unto this nation, is something that he once said to Rabbi Sachs, or about Rabbi Sachs, that attributes. And so Chanukah represents that ability to be a light. But I think what the big message, that it's really about the light representing the light of Torah. And the miracle of the menorah symbolizes, and what's so chaviv to us, why it's so precious to us, is because it shows the resilience of the Jewish people, our perseverance, our ability to keep Torah, perpetuate that Masorah, even under the most difficult of circumstances. And we're going to continue figuring it out. We're going to continue doing Torah and mitzvos, even by Zoom for now. We're going to keep plugging away. We're going to celebrate Hanukkah this year. It's not going to be with as many people as usual, but we're going to do our best, and we're going to light the menorah, and we're going to hold on and cling on to that light to get through this period of time for better times up ahead. Yeah, Lani.
Okay, so two things. One maybe a little trivial, and one the broader aspect of all of this. What's the difference? What makes the oil pure? That it hasn't been used before?
Very good. So from a halachic perspective, Lani, that's a great question. From a halachic perspective, so purity means that it never touched, or never came into contact with a dead body.
The oil.
The oil. What I said, yeah, the oil never came into contact with a dead body or a dead insect or a reptile. And there are certain people who are tameh. You know, we don't keep the laws of tumah nowadays. The only law that we keep nowadays is that a kohen is not allowed to go to a cemetery, right? Not allowed to go to a funeral. But other than that, we're not sensitive. We don't keep a lot of laws of tumah, because really it relates to karbanot, and it relates to the Beis Hamikdash. So from a halachic perspective, Lani, purity means that it stayed away usually from things that are relating to death or destruction.
Rabbi, one comment?
Okay.
From a physical perspective, pure and refined oil is also that it's very, very high quality, that it's
okay, that actually makes more sense, because I don't know where oil would be in touch with any dead animal or any dead people. But that makes a lot of sense. But the other thing that I wanted to perhaps comment on is, before you were talking about the difference between Purim and Chanukah, and that we do more somehow for Purim. That's I think what you intimated. And to me, Chanukah, if Purim, we had the threat, but we never actually went to war. People weren't actually killed. I mean, there was the threat of that, but that never actually happened. But Chanukah, yes, people were killed. There was a battle, and it was almost like the 6-day war. It was miraculous how it ended. So actually, to me, it's more significant. It has much more significance for future generations, and as for its educational value, that despite the horrors and despite everything, we came through and we were victorious. And so to me, it has more of a significance for our generation, for future generations, and should be more celebrated, I think, than, you were saying before that we do more for Purim. We have the Sudan.
Right. So two things, Lani. Thanks for your comments, as always. Two things. Number one, in terms of the oil, what the Greeks did was that, I think if they handled it, they desecrated it intentionally. A lot of these oils. So that's what happened. But in terms of
I have a question.
Why?
Like wine.
Like wine. That's right. But in terms of the military victory, so that it does play. I didn't mean to say that Purim is more than Chanukah. It's celebrated in a different way, Purim. It's celebrated in a more physical, materialistic way a little bit, while Chanukah is celebrated in a more spiritual, in a spiritual kind of way of Hallel, right? Hallel every day of Chanukah, and the menorah is spiritual. But also, just to remind you, there was a military battle. There was a major military battle in Purim as well, where on the third, right, in Chanukah, that's a major thing that was against the odds. In Purim, it does seem like kind of like Hashem is kind of running the show more in Purim, But there was a battle on the 13th of Adar, if you remember, where the Jewish people, that's one of the reasons why we fast on Tanis Esther, one of the reasons, because there was a battle that day. But you're right, Lonnie, in terms of it doesn't seem it seems more as if like God is just like was helping the Jews win at that time. But the Jews had to fight in Purim. There was an element of war on Purim as well.
I have a question.
But wait,
Is there any significance to the fact that the Chashmonaim were Kohanim? Because Kohanim is purity. Kohanim have to be, there's like Kedusha. They can't come into contact with Tumah. And that they're the ones that rededicated the Beit HaMikdash, and they're the ones who serve in the Beit HaMikdash, and that they wanted Pach Shem and Tahor, they wanted pure, nothing defiled, nothing with Tumah. So is there like a thread that runs through this with the fact that the Chashmonaim were Kohanim? Can there be a connection there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. That the Kohanim were the ones who led the way, because they were the ones who were there to protect purity and to teach Torah and spirituality to the Jews, and so they took the lead in rededicating and sanctifying the temple. Absolutely. The only question is whether they should have chosen the political leadership. Yeah, Yala.
So if I may, a real quick, picking up on what Miriam had said before about the light. Rav Kook had written something, and I'll just translate it, make it very short. Every person needs to know that there is a candle lit inside of them, and his candle is unlike the candle of anyone else. And also we need to understand that the Or Haner Barabim, the candlelight in many, can become a flame that lights up the world, which is what we need at this point in time for all of us.
Wonderful. So that's beautiful. Let me just end, Ron, with your permission. Let me end with two things. Number one is a very, very powerful picture that you might have once seen, where it's a picture of the swastika,
yes,
in the background with a menorah in the foreground, and it's Rachel Posner wrote the following poem on the back of the photograph, saying, "Death to Judah, so the flag says, but the light answers. The light of the menorah answers, Judah will live forever." And so that's in terms of the way we were able to turn things around. From the Shoah and after the ashes and the aftermath of the ashes of the Shoah, to establish the state of Israel and to be where we are today. So that's the story of the revival of the Jewish people, and that's a lot the story of Chanukah. The second thing I'll just leave you with, I might have shared this with you, so I'll just tell you quickly. It's not something to waste, but I'll tell you quickly just to end the shir, which is the story of the Yehuda Avner, right? Remember when he left the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And Lubavitch Rebbe said that his mission in life was to help light the candle of every Jew.
exactly.
And he would bring the tradition. He felt that he needed to bring the tradition of Torah to every Jew's candle. So when Yehuda Avner was walking out, he said to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he said, "So Rebbe, did you light my candle?" And Lubavitcher Rebbe answered and he said, "No, I didn't. I gave you the match. I gave you the match. Every Jew has a responsibility to light her or his own candle."
Exactly.
Okay, yeah. So Yasher Koach, everyone. Ron, you share your thought.